to Just One Thing for Parents. I'm Bettina Honan. Today, we're tackling a sensitive but really crucial topic that many families face, which is how to support children during parental separation. I'm joined by Dr. Marielle Quint, who's a clinical psychologist who's got a lot of experience of working in this field, in more generally in child and adolescent mental health. And to be honest, I've often been asked by parents, whether a separation will affect their child. And of course, it will affect them. It's a significant life event. But being affected doesn't mean they have to be damaged by it. And that's where today's discussion really comes in. So she answers the question, what's just one thing parents can do to prioritize their children's need while going through a separation? So she's got some great guidance for how to kind of minimize this negative impact. She talks about managing age-appropriate, honest conversations, addressing difficulties between adults, which inevitably are going to be there. There may well be hard feelings, and making sure that your child doesn't think that the separation is their fault, which is really important. She's got some really helpful resources. I'll put those in the show notes and also in the Substack post, which I've started doing for each episode. So whether you're going through a separation, someone who is, or you just want to be prepared, this episode is really essential advice for supporting kids during this major family transition. So keep listening for my interview with Dr. Marielle Quint. Hello and welcome, Marielle. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Bettina. It's lovely to be here.
So the question for you is, what's just one thing parents can do to hold children's needs in mind while separating? Such an important question. I wonder if you could start by just saying a little about why you chose this question, why you feel like this is such an important thing for parents to think about.
Sure, absolutely. I think why I chose this question is because I've had quite a lot of experience, unfortunately, in supporting families and specifically children through separation and even divorces. I think it's an area where parents can do lots of things. I know we're focusing on one main thing, but there are lots of small things that parents and families can do together to make this horrid process just that little bit easier for children and young people.
Mm.
I think that's probably a good place to start, that it usually is a horrid process. I
Yeah.
think it's important not to make any assumptions about the fact that what led to that moment and how anyone might be feeling. I think it's such a unique experience and people go through it in such a different way. And I think that's probably a good first place to start, that each member of the family, parents may be in a lot of pain. Parents may not have got to this place by mutual agreement. It may be one partner more than the other person. And it's a really useful place to start in thinking that this is a difficult place that anyone finds themselves in and doesn't anticipate finding themselves in. And there's so many things to think about, isn't there, with different ages and stages of children and where everyone is. So I think there's a lot to think about, and we can think about a main thing and lots of small things that people can do
Mm.
to make it just slightly better.
And that's such a kind of lovely place to start, I think, and it's in everything that we do in our work is to start by just validating people's feelings and saying, this is hard. This is not going to be necessarily easy, and it's going to be hard for different members of the family in different ways.
Absolutely. Yes. So in terms of the main thing that sort of popped into my mind, I think we're really lucky, Bettina, because I know you and I know that in many areas of our work, the research says different things. Some researchers have these findings and other researchers will find different things. And I think the thing here is that the research is really unanimous. They did a lot of work in the 70s, and the biggest finding that they came is the takeaway is that it's the ongoing conflict that is associated with children and young people having adverse experiences of separation and divorce.
Right.
So I think that is the main thing. If I can give just one thing for parents, is to try and avoid, and I know it's not always easy, but to try and find different ways through to take the conflict, if it is ongoing, away from children and young people, and hopefully to do some work as parents, as partners, in co-parenting. And maybe perhaps later we can touch on when co-parenting is not helpful, sometimes it's useful to think about parallel parenting where communication is kind of minimized. But we want to think about putting children and young people's needs at the center of this process. And I know that that can be really, really difficult. And perhaps you and I can think further about ways in which ongoing conflict can be avoided.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, because I suppose there's going to be hard feelings around, aren't there, between the adults, I imagine. They'll look different for different people. But what you're saying is managing that in a way that is helpful around children. Would you say don't ever have conflict, or would you say it's about how you manage the conflict?
Exactly. I think it's very, very much about how you manage the conflict. And I think that's the case in all families, isn't it?
Mm.
So I think it's quite a Herculean ask to kind of say, let's just make everything nice and lovely. Of course, that's not going to be realistic. Of course, there's going to be big feelings likely for each parent at different times, and children and young people certainly so. Um, I think what's really, really tricky when you're thinking about this process is both separating out yourself from your probably ex-partner and your children's needs. It gets so muddled, doesn't it? And I think a really, really lovely way of thinking about it that can feel really helpful, what families tell me certainly, is when I just point out very simply that children are half of each of their parent, and they very much want to be free to love both parts of themselves and each of their parents. So I think if they have the option as much as possible to be able to do that, and I think that can really help parents hold that need in mind. Um, in fact, I don't know if you know the wonderful Lisa Damour. She
Yes.
she describes a beautiful, and she always has such an elegant way of doing so. She describes, even if you really, really can't think of anything worse than your ex-partner, you can do it in a beautiful way. So you can pick up on something in your child and say, gosh, you just have the best sense of direction. That is exactly like your dad. You do not get that from me. So you're finding something in your child to belong to the part of themselves that doesn't belong to you. And I just think that is such a wonderful way of doing it.
Wow.
Um,
I
yeah.
love that. What a great, because I think one of the hardest things is that you might feel really angry towards your ex-partner. And that anger can sometimes come out. But what you're saying is really important, that whatever happens, they are half of your child. And if you're saying bad things about them to their child, that's going to be incredibly hard for their child to know what to do with that information.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it really sets up a kind of internal conflict for them.
Yeah.
Um, of course, there are going to be difficult feelings, and I think it does. The Herculean task of this gets even more so if you're dealing with an ex-partner whose behavior is simply not acceptable, if they are not telling the truth or not showing up for their child and not doing what they say they're going to do.
Yeah.
That's even more difficult to navigate. And I think the thing that you can keep doing is trying where humanly possible to kind of keep things neutral and kind of observing what you're seeing for your child and kind of saying, I can see that you're hugely disappointed. I had also thought that dad was going to turn up, or mum, sorry, to be dad
Yeah. Yeah.
centered,
Yeah.
either parent,
Yeah.
um, uh, turn up at 3 o'clock today, and I know it's 20 past 3, and you feel really sad that they're not here. So I think it's that thin line, isn't it, between never lying to your child and kind
Mm.
of speaking the truth, but kind of keeping things as neutral as possible, which obviously can sometimes be much, much easier than other times.
Absolutely. And is it helpful, do you think, for parents to own their own emotions, to maybe say, you know what, I feel quite angry with mum right now, or I feel quite angry with dad right now? Or would you say don't do that?
That's a really good question, Bettina, and I think it depends a little bit more on the ages and stages of children. Um, I think what's really useful to separate for anyone is what is the children's responsibility and tasks,
Mm.
and what are the adults' responsibility and decisions and tasks. So I think that there very well may be times where parents just can't help it and they kind of say, I'm feeling really, really cross with your mum right now. But I think you could do a little bit of an add-on to that and kind of say, that's that's not because you've done anything wrong, or this is the adult stuff, and the adults will take the responsibility to sort this out. The adults are having support to navigate this, whether it's kind of therapy or mediation. And I think that's where you'd be inclined to communicate that in a little bit more detail with older children, adolescents,
Yeah.
and you'd be much less inclined for the younger ones. I think for the younger ones, keeping things really simple, really clear, and really concise is most helpful, actually.
Yeah. Because we know that if children don't have a reason for something, if they
Mm.
see something, if they see that you're angry and you don't name it, and maybe they don't know what's going on, they'll make up a story, won't they? And
100%.
and the chances are they'll make up a story, or they might make up a story that puts them in a bad light. I did something. I made life so difficult for mum. That's why she had to leave. Or we have to really be careful about
Yeah.
that.
Yes. And I think it's safe to say that we don't need to make any assumptions other than that one, Bettina, that children do try to put narratives together, don't they, to try and make sense of quite a new and an overwhelming and a difficult situation. And I think it's really worth saying to children, probably at most ages, other than the almost adults, this is not your fault. There is nothing that you did or you didn't do here that has led to this situation. This is between us as parents, as adults. And I think it's also important not only just to stay in the present, but also to go back into the past. It's nothing that you have done.
Mm.
And I also think it's worth naming, saying there's nothing that you could do in the future that's going to influence or impact this to make the outcome any different. I know that perhaps part of you wishes that you might be able to make it different, but unfortunately, this is where we find ourselves as a family, and nothing nothing's going to change the love and the security and the support that you have from each of us. But
Mm.
unfortunately, we are not staying together as a couple.
Yeah.
Something appropriate for different age ranges. So for the little ones in a much more simplistic and clear way. And perhaps that was about right for an adolescent, early adolescent.
Yeah, yeah. That's so clear, filling in the gaps, being honest, but also saying you don't have to try to make this better. Because I think sometimes when that has been a separation, there maybe has been a time when there has been conflict. And, I've certainly worked with adults who say, as a child, I used to work really hard to be the best child I could be so that they didn't fight or something like that. Like
Yeah,
it could have been going on for a while, couldn't it?
absolutely.
Mm.
And I remember very distinctly, actually, a family who were very, very, very occupied with the exact words and the exact process and the moment of telling the children about the separation. And I remember the mum coming after and saying, it was so weird. He just, bounced off my bed and said, Mum, are we going swimming? And please, can I have an orange juice? And I think that's a really helpful thing to think, that this is never a moment. It's very much a process, isn't it? That evolves. It takes time. It adapts, and it's about not making assumptions about if it has been going on for a long time, and there is really a sense of an awful feeling in the family and a sort of dread around being together. Sometimes some young people I've seen said it's such a relief.
Mm.
So I think there
Yeah.
is room for all sorts of feelings that come up. I'm sure it won't only ever be relief or only ever be bad feelings. There's likely to be a lot of ambivalence and a lot of different feelings that come up over time with different parts of themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you had a child, maybe a teenager who said, I don't want to see the other parent, how would you advise a family to manage that?
Yeah. This is a really tricky scenario because it's so painful, isn't it?
Mm.
It's so difficult to feel rejected by your child. It's so difficult to feel like one parent is being favored at any age or in any situation, I think. Um, I think you want to encourage space and time for that, maybe making the room for emotional expression. And it might be that this isn't a child who wants to talk about things. It might be that you sort of bring things up in a very subtle way. I'm finding myself really curious what's happening for you at the moment. Perhaps when you're walking side by side with them or in a car, so you're not having that really intense kind of adolescent, particularly eye contact. It might be that this is a child that will take more time. It might be that this is a child that will need to do more tennis because that's the way they process their emotions,
Mhm.
or go off and do some beautiful drawings, or want to be with their friends more. And that's their way of processing. These things take time and they do evolve and they don't tend to stay static, is my experience.
Yes. So that's so helpful. Absolutely. Because I think we can overreact sometimes to those big statements from kids. And often they are emotional statements. They'll say, I don't ever want to see him again, or I don't ever want to see her again. And I love that idea of being really curious and saying, gosh, over time, let's unpack what's really going on. It's so helpful.
Yeah. And I think it's useful to know that there are lots of people around to help. So
Mm.
if they did later on express, that things felt difficult or they were feeling low or they just didn't know how to unpack things, we have thankfully some amazing family therapists, some amazing counselors.
Mm.
Um, whether it's for parents to think about coming together to be co-parents or even parallel parents, or a child or a young person, there is great support out there.
What do you just say a little about the difference between co-parents and parallel parents?
Yeah.
Just
I think when coming to the end of a marriage has been more of a mutual decision, it's easier to hold children's needs in mind because it's been arrived at together. And I think when if we think about kind of the sort of Gwyneth level conscious
oh
uncoupling,
yeah, Gwyneth Paltrow and Chris.
yes,
Yeah. Mm.
and Gwyneth, you seem to, from a very outsider perspective, seem to have navigated it well. Who knows, how long that took and the process and how much support. But I think it's about whether both parents can put aside their own feelings and have enough support for themselves in order to be able to hold their children's needs in mind and navigate it together.
Mm.
Um, Again, Lisa and actually Amelia Dowling, I wanted to mention. Amelia Dowling has spent her whole career. She is the most wonderful therapist. I went to a training with her, and this is actually my number one book. I'm coming back to the question.
Oh
It's
yeah.
small, so it's very,
Yeah.
very digestible. Understanding children's needs when parents separate. It's
Mm.
Amelia Dowling and Di Elliott. And I recommend that families get two copies. And it's just very practical tips, kind of having access to both parents at the same time. That's where they kind of really talk about what optimal co-parenting looks like.
Right.
And I think, unfortunately, as we've touched on already, sometimes it's just not possible. There is too much pain, there is too much hurt, it's just too difficult. Perhaps one parent is more able to hold the children's needs in mind than the other, or there are just different approaches, or there just isn't agreement on what's possible. Um, and Lisa was talking, I was listening to a very, very old piece of work where she touched on how helpful email had been
Mm.
for parents who found it difficult to come together and think, and just being able to type that message out, reflect on it, digest it, maybe come back to it later when there are difficult feelings involved, it can be really helpful. And there are not just email, many, many apps. There's one which I can try and find the name of. I think it's something like Wizard Parenting app where the interactions are recorded, and that means
Oh.
when parents aren't behaving in ways that are acceptable, they might think more about how their communication is going across. And unfortunately, obviously, sometimes this does end up in the court space, and that can feel really useful and helpful.
Right.
So there are ways of supporting that kind of parallel parenting when communication obviously has to happen, schedules and communication about things needs to be done, but in ways that feel kind of palatable and
Yeah.
manageable.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. It's all such helpful stuff. Thank you so much. If we could finish just to say, if there's just one thing you could advise parents, what would that be?
I think because the research is so clear, and as clinical psychologists, we love to have our sort of science and evidence bases behind us. The research is really clear that children do the best when they can be in two separate but loving, stable, predictable, secure homes. And that means avoiding the ongoing conflict where possible. That
Yeah.
would be just one thing.
Amazing. Oh, Marielle, thank you so much for coming on today. That's just been so helpful for parents. Yeah, in these really difficult circumstances. So thank you.
That's okay. It's my pleasure. I also wanted to say, actually, there are some brilliant books out there
Yeah,
for lots of different ages and stages. And maybe if they could, I will send you some resources and they can go in the podcast notes for anyone who's
yeah,
um, navigating this at the moment. I wish them all the best.
that would be so helpful. Oh, thanks. I'll put those in the notes. Yeah. Oh, okay. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.